Okay, let's unpack this. Tonight we are intentionally slowing our pace a bit. We're stepping gently, into a realm that's really defined by mist, by philosophy, and this enduring human fascination.
hmm
We are doing a deep dive, but it's not really into a lost island, is it? It's more into a lost idea. We're analyzing the paradox of Atlantis.
It's a truly remarkable subject, and the sources you've gathered really track the life of this myth so meticulously. You see Atlantis travel from its ancient beginning as this very carefully crafted philosophical tool,
Right.
right through centuries of, well, speculation,
Yeah.
pseudo-archaeology, and even into the often quite feverish world of modern conspiracy theories.
And the goal, then, for you listening, is fundamentally reflective. Our mission, I suppose, is to understand the profound journey of this idea. How could what seems like a simple allegory, mentioned only twice by one philosopher, how did it grow into the world's most researched, most speculated upon, and arguably the most enduring lost civilization story?
Well, to set the stage, let's just confirm what we know for certain. Atlantis originates solely, and I mean solely, from the writings of the Greek philosopher Plato. These were penned around 360 BC.
Okay.
He described a mighty naval empire, situated far out in the Atlantic Ocean, that supposedly sank beneath the waves. This happened after a failed military campaign against Athens and a devastating catastrophe lasting just a single day and night.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. We're dedicating this whole exploration, this deep dive, to an island that, well, classical scholars overwhelmingly agree likely never existed.
That's the consensus, yes.
Yet its conceptual existence, the idea of it, has profoundly shaped historical thinking, literature, esoteric beliefs across global cultures for millennia. So we'll deliberately try to separate Plato's calm, deliberate intent from just the flood of imaginative theories that came later.
So to begin, we really must restrict ourselves entirely to the blueprint, the absolute foundation. There are only two primary sources for the entire Atlantis narrative.
Only two.
Only two. Plato's dialogues. First, there's Timaeus, which sort of introduces the story, sets the scene, and then there's its successor, Critias, which unfortunately is incomplete, but it's the one that gives us all the juicy details, the description.
Okay.
Every single mention, every theory, every movie, every book about Atlantis since then,
Yeah.
it all derives ultimately from just these two texts.
And Plato he was very careful, wasn't he? He constructed this narrative frame, the story within a story, that gave it an air of deep antiquity, real authority.
Precisely. He relays the account through the character Critias. Not Plato speaking directly, but Critias.
Right, the character.
And Critias claims it was this old family tradition passed down through generations, originating way back with the famous Athenian lawgiver Solon,
Solon, the respected statesman.
the very one.
Yeah.
And Solon, according to the story, supposedly learned this history while he was traveling in Egypt from Egyptian priests, sometime between, say, 590 and 580 BC.
Egyptian priests. That adds another layer of ancient wisdom, doesn't it?
Exactly. And these priests apparently claimed the catastrophic events, the sinking of Atlantis, took place an astounding 9,000 years before Solon's own time.
9,000 years before Solon. That's immense.
It's almost unfathomable in the Greek context. Placing it so far in the past, long before any known Greek history, gave the tale this almost mythical weight right from the start.
So the genius of the framing learned in Egypt, passed down through Solon, through family tradition, it provided that critical element of, what's the word? Verisimilitude, believability.
It lent it credibility, yes.
Ah.
But if we peel back that narrative layer, the fundamental purpose, as classicists have consistently argued, seems purely philosophical.
No history, then.
Not history in the way we understand it. Plato introduced Atlantis, it's argued, as an elaborate allegory. A story designed to illustrate the dangers of unchecked power, the hubris of nations.
Hubris, yeah.
That's
That fatal pride.
He used this wealthy, militarily successful, but ultimately corrupt naval empire Atlantis to highlight the moral superiority of his own political theories, the ones he'd already laid out in his earlier work, The Republic.
Ah, so it connects back to the Republic, the ideal state.
Precisely. The narrative contrast is absolutely everything here. Ancient Athens, in this story, a sort of idealized prehistoric Athens, successfully defeats the invading Atlanteans. They are portrayed as the perfect society.
How so? What made them perfect in this story?
Well, they were frugal, virtuous, focused entirely on civic duty, guided by wisdom.
Yeah.
All the qualities Plato admired.
Okay, the ideal. And Atlantis.
Atlantis is the perfect antithesis. They were fabulously rich, technologically advanced for their time, focused entirely on expansion, on conquest, on material accumulation.
Sounds familiar, perhaps.
Indeed. And the tale details their gradual moral decline. Initially, you see, they honored Poseidon, their divine ancestor, and they valued virtue. But over generations, their divine essence became diluted, weakened by mixing too much with mortals. Their human nature took over.
And this loss of divine character, this is what leads to their doom in the story.
That's the core of the moral lesson. They start valuing material things, gold, power, territory, over the spiritual, over justice and virtue. The Atlanteans, who were insolently advancing to conquer all of Europe and Asia.
Big ambitions.
Huge. They were defeated by the humble, virtuous Athenians. And then, swiftly, almost immediately after, their island was just devoured by the sea. The catastrophic submersion was the ultimate divine judgment, the ultimate moral lesson against imperial overreach and corruption.
Wow. So the story itself is the punishment, in a way.
In a very direct way. And we can delve a bit deeper into the physical details Plato provides, mostly in the Critias, because those details really reinforce this moral point.
Okay, like what?
Well, the island's location, first off, it was located beyond what Plato calls the Pillars of Hercules. Now, we typically understand that today as the Strait of Gibraltar.
Yeah, the entrance to the Atlantic.
But its size was almost unimaginable to the Greeks listening to this. He says it was larger than ancient Libya and Asia Minor, basically North Africa and Turkey combined.
Larger than that. That's enormous. A continent, almost.
It implies a vast central landmass, not just a small island. The description even suggests that travelers could cross from this main island to other neighboring islands, and from those secondary islands, ultimately reach the, quote, entire continent that encompasses the Atlantic Ocean, presumably referring to the Americas, though Plato wouldn't have known that name.
So the scale itself is part of the warning, their sheer size and power.
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
And their wealth and engineering were absolutely central to their arrogance. The myth says Poseidon, the sea god, received the island as his domain. He fell in love with a mortal woman there named Plato.
Okay.
Their eldest son, Atlas, became the first and rightful king of the whole island confederation. And the ocean, the Atlantic, was eventually named in his honor.
Atlas, holding up the world, or maybe just holding this vast empire.
A fitting name, perhaps. And the capital city was described as this marble of circular design, built around a sacred central mountain where Plato had lived. It was protected by 3 concentric circular moats, massive ones, separated by rings of land.
Like a target.
Exactly like a target.
Yeah.
They built impressive bridges over these moats and even carved huge tunnels under the land rings, large enough for ships to navigate right into the inner harbor, into the city center. It was an engineering feat.
Incredible sophistication.
And the detail on the construction materials is particularly telling, revealing their opulence. Plato says the Atlanteans quarried 3 distinct types of rock, red, white, and black, from the very rings of land they created.
Using the land itself.
Yes. They built massive walls around each ring and then covered them in precious metals. The outer wall was coated in brass, the middle wall in tin, and the innermost wall, the one around the central citadel.
What was that one?
That one gleamed with this mysterious, highly sought-after precious metal called orichalcum.
Orichalcum, that sounds exotic. What was it supposed to be?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Its exact identity is debated. Maybe a naturally occurring gold-copper alloy like tumbaga, or perhaps a kind of mountain brass. But Plato elevates it, describes it as flashing with fiery light and second only to gold in value. It becomes the ultimate symbol of Atlantean addiction to luxury and wealth.
So coating their walls in it?
It perfectly illustrates their priorities, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Their power, their defenses were literally covered in this stuff, emphasizing the staggering riches that directly preceded their moral collapse.
And that collapse, as you said, was swift. Brutal.
Very. Having conquered vast territories across the Mediterranean, reaching into Europe and Africa, the Atlantean rulers finally lost the favor of the gods completely. They were successfully repulsed by the superior virtue of those proto-Athenians,
The moral victory.
followed immediately by divine retribution. Due to violent earthquakes and floods happening in just one day and one night, the entire island vanished beneath the sea. And Plato adds this final detail. It left behind only an impassable shoal of mud and silt.
Blocking the way.
Blocking the way, yeah. A physical manifestation of their moral obstruction, perhaps. It truly remains a masterclass in philosophical fiction designed to make you think.
Okay, so the moment Plato puts the story out there, the process of interpretation just explodes, right? It's fascinating that even though the philosophical intent seems pretty clear to scholars now, there was immediate, intense debate. Was this real history or just a story? Even among Plato's own circle.
Indeed, right from the get-go. And the earliest, and arguably the most authoritative skeptic, was Aristotle. Plato's own star student.
Aristotle, what did he think?
He firmly dismissed it. His view, as recorded by later writers like Strabo, was basically that his master, Plato, had invented the whole thing purely as a literary device, a tool to help teach philosophical and political lessons. The man who dreamed it up made it disappear, is the gist of what he supposedly said.
Wow. Straight from the horse's mouth, almost.
Almost. And that fundamental belief that Atlantis is a fictional construct has remained the foundational consensus among classical scholars ever since.
But the seeds of belief were sown early too, weren't they? You mentioned the philosopher Crantor. He came a bit later, a student of Plato's student, Xenocrates. He's often cited as maybe the first person to treat the story as potentially historical fact.
Yes, but this point requires really careful, slow consideration. Because the evidence for Crantor's belief is, frankly, highly ambiguous. We only know about his alleged belief through the writings of a much later Neoplatonist philosopher named Proclus, writing centuries later.
So it's secondhand information.
Very secondhand. And Proclus's text is often translated, sometimes quite sensationally, to suggest that Crantor actually traveled to Egypt and saw hieroglyphic pillars or inscriptions there that confirmed Plato's story was true.
Okay, that sounds like proof.
It sounds like it. But hold on. If Aristotle, Plato's immediate student, the father of logic, was convinced it was pure invention, how did these later thinkers justify believing it? What was their counter-evidence?
Good question.
Well, they likely operated without the direct context of Plato's teaching circle. They might have simply relied on the story's own internal claims, the verisimilitude we talked about, that whole Solon in Egypt connection.
Okay.
But when scholars look closely at the actual Greek text concerning Crantor, the specific pronoun used in Proclus's account when discussing who saw these supposed Egyptian pillars confirming the story is unclear. It's ambiguous. Meaning, as the classicist Alan Cameron argued quite persuasively, the pronoun might actually refer back to Plato himself, using the framework of an Egyptian trip to lend his own story credibility, rather than Crantor finding independent external confirmation in Egypt centuries later.
So the proof might just be Plato reinforcing his own narrative device.
Precisely. So even the primary textual evidence cited for ancient belief in Atlantis is fundamentally shaky. It could be built on a mistranslation or, at best, an ambiguous reference that doesn't prove what believers want it to prove.
Nonetheless, belief persisted somehow. Later Roman-era geographers, you mentioned Strabo and Posidonius, they found the idea of a lost continent plausible enough to include it in their descriptions of the world.
They did. The idea had taken root. And this belief crossed cultural boundaries, too. Early Jewish philosophers like Philo of Alexandria and prominent Christian writers like Tertullian and Arnobius seem to have accepted Atlantis as a real place that existed once. Sometimes they even adapted the catastrophe story to fit their own theological narratives, perhaps linking it to the Great Flood or similar events.
Interesting how it gets absorbed into different worldviews.
Very. And the geographical ambiguity we touched on also played a massive role in shaping these early interpretations. Plato located Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules. For us today, that means one thing: the Strait of Gibraltar.
Right, out in the Atlantic.
But the sources suggest it might be more complex. There's scholarly debate that before the 6th century BC, the term Pillars of Hercules might have been applied more broadly, perhaps less specifically.
Like where?
Well, some classicists argue the name might have referred to prominent mountains on either side of the Gulf of Laconia. That's the southernmost gulf in mainland Greece, opening south towards Crete.
Okay, so within the Mediterranean.
Potentially. If the pillars were originally understood to be, say, near the Peloponnese, that drastically changes the geographical setting. It suddenly lends immense credence to the theory that the entire story wasn't pure fiction, but was perhaps historically inspired by a known major disaster within the Mediterranean basin itself.
That location, opening towards Crete in Egypt, that brings us right to the strongest candidate for historical inspiration, doesn't it? The Minoan eruption.
Exactly. The massive volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, which is modern Santorini, probably in the 17th or 16th century BC. This was a truly cataclysmic event in the Bronze Age, Agent.
Santorini, yeah. Beautiful place now, but...
But back then, devastating. The eruption likely caused a tremendous tsunami that would have ravaged the northern coast of Crete, the center of the sophisticated Minoan civilization. That event fits the core criteria remarkably well. The sudden, violent destruction of an advanced maritime culture by natural forces.
And it's geographically plausible.
Very. And it's conceivable that the memory of such a huge disaster could have been preserved, perhaps exaggerated over time, passed down through oral traditions, maybe reaching Egyptian record keepers, and eventually finding its way to Solon and then Plato, who adapted it for his own philosophical purposes.
Okay, that makes a certain kind of sense. Connecting this thread now, we see the allegorical aspect resurface really powerfully during the European Renaissance, right? Thinkers started explicitly using Atlantis again, but maybe not as literal history this time.
Correct. It became more of a conceptual tool again, a framework for discussing political ideals, imagining better societies, thinking about the future.
Like Thomas More.
Yes, exactly. Thomas More famously used the legend, at least implicitly, as inspiration for his 1516 work, Utopia, a fictional ideal society on an island. And Francis Bacon, in the early 17th century, wrote his unfinished utopian novel, New Atlantis.
And where did Bacon place his New Atlantis?
Significantly, he placed his vision of a scientifically advanced, rational society in the newly explored territories of the Americas.
Ah, the New World connection. This coincided perfectly with the Age of Exploration, didn't it? Suddenly, Atlantis wasn't just an ancient myth. It became a philosophical canvas for contemplating the possibilities opening up across the Atlantic.
Precisely. Some 16th century scholars, like the Spanish historian Francisco López de Gomara, actually started suggesting that Plato's lost civilization literally referred to the recently discovered Americas. The philosophical desire to find a better place, a utopia, started merging with the geographical reality of these vast, unknown lands.
Fascinating. And this search for geographical plausibility even started touching on kind of early geological ideas. You mentioned Abraham Ortelius.
Yes, Ortelius, the famous Flemish cartographer. In 1596, he hypothesized that the continents Europe, Africa, and the Americas had once been joined. He looked at the maps he was drawing.
And he saw the fit, like puzzle pieces.
He saw the indentations of the coastlines facing each other and suggested Atlantis wasn't simply sunk, but was violently torn away from Europe and Africa during some great cataclysm. He wrote that the coastlines showed traces of the ruptures.
That's incredible. It's like an early glimmer of continental drift theory centuries before it was scientifically established.
That's a stunningly intuitive observation, even if speculative at the time. And it was linked directly to explaining the Atlantis catastrophe.
So the utopian writers, the explorers, the early cartographers, they collectively created this intellectual space, didn't they? A potentially real, profoundly advanced civilization, geographically plausible somewhere between the old world and the new. This just sets the perfect stage for the next dramatic turn in the story, the explosion of interest in the 19th century.
Absolutely. The transition from Renaissance philosophy and early speculation to 19th century amateur archaeology and occultism. This fundamentally transformed Atlantis. It shifted from being primarily an allegory or a geographical puzzle into becoming the absolute bedrock of modern esoteric belief and conspiracy theories.
And this seismic shift really kicks off in America, right, with one particular book.
Yes, with Ignatius Donnelly. His book, Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, published in 1882, was a watershed moment. It wasn't just suggesting Atlantis might have been real, it presented a comprehensive, seemingly scientific thesis arguing that it was real.
And what was his core argument?
Donnelly proposed that Atlantis was the technologically advanced source culture, a single origin point from which all other major ancient civilizations, Egyptian, Mayan, Incan, European, derive their key features. Their architecture, agriculture, metallurgy, language, myths, religions, everything.
Wow, that's a huge claim, the mother culture of everything.
Exactly. He was trying to solve the puzzle of parallel development. Why do pyramids appear in Egypt and Mexico? Why are there similar flood myths across cultures? Donnelly argued these similarities could only be explained if they all descended from a common, superior ancestor civilization, Atlantis.
So it wasn't independent invention, it was diffusion from Atlantis.
That was his argument. He synthesized tons of examples, comparing myths, artifacts, languages across continents. He even claimed Atlantis was the original Garden of Eden from the Bible and was destroyed by the Great Flood.
He's really considered the father of the modern Atlantis myth industry, isn't he?
Absolutely.
Oh.
By providing hundreds of these comparative examples, many superficial or based on flawed data, but impressive in volume, he popularized the idea that ancient myths contain hidden literal truths. And crucially, that these truths were accessible not through boring academic study, but through the ingenious interpretations of amateur enthusiasts working outside the establishment.
That fostered a whole culture of alternative history, didn't it?
Immediately. And his work directly fueled these diffusion theories connecting Atlantis specifically to the Americas. This is where we encounter the rise of Mayanism, this complex, often quite problematic fascination with Mayan civilization in the 19th century.
Problematic how?
Well, figures like the French writer Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg and later Augustus Le Plongeon started speculating that the incredible ruins being rediscovered in Mesoamerica, the pyramids, the temples, the complex carvings left by Mayan and Aztec cultures, they argued these couldn't possibly have been the products of indigenous genius alone. They must have been remnants of, or at least heavily influenced by, Atlantean colonists or survivors.
Ah, so it denies credit to the indigenous cultures themselves.
That's the implicit and sometimes explicit underpinning. This speculation relied heavily on that flawed concept of diffusionism, the idea that major cultural advancements almost always spread from a single, often superior, usually implicitly white or non-indigenous source. Plongeon, for instance, even claimed he had translated ancient Maya texts, proving direct connections to Egyptian gods and ultimately to Atlantis. His translations are now considered completely fanciful by Mayanists.
Okay, so Donnelly popularizes it. Diffusion theories connect it to the Americas. Then the occult world really takes the ball and runs with it, right? Into some really wild territory with theosophy.
That's the next major leap. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the Russian-born co-founder of the Theosophical Society, built massively upon Donnelly's framework. In her huge, sprawling 1888 work, The Secret Doctrine, she integrated Atlantis into her incredibly elaborate cosmological system.
And what was Atlantis according to Blavatsky?
She claimed, within her complex history of humanity evolving through various root races, that the Atlanteans were the fourth great root race. And these weren't just advanced humans. She asserted they possessed highly developed psychic and supernatural powers, telepathy, manipulating energies, things far beyond modern capabilities.
Psychic superheroes, basically.
In a sense, yes. And this is where the timeline just explodes astronomically. Plato suggested Atlantis existed maybe 11,000 or 12,000 years ago, vast but comprehensible antiquity. Blavatsky, she provided this astonishing timeline.
How far back?
She claimed the Atlantean civilization reached its peak, developed these incredible powers, and then ultimately destroyed itself through internal warfare wars fought using these misused psychic and technological forces somewhere between 1 million and 900,000 years ago.
1 million years ago. That's just a completely different scale.
A truly gargantuan leap. It removes Atlantis entirely from any possible connection to human history as we understand it, and places it squarely in the realm of, well, cosmic myth. And what's also quite unsettling as we reflect calmly on this idea's journey is how Blavatsky's concept of these root races, including the Atlanteans, was later picked up and distorted.
How so?
These ideas were twisted, particularly by figures in the early 20th century German Ariosophic movement. This was a sort of Volkish ideology blending German nationalism, esotericism, and racial theory. People like Karl Georg Setch and later, more infamously, Alfred Rosenberg, who became a key Nazi ideologue.
Yeah.
They seized on the idea of advanced Atlanteans, but claimed they were specifically Hyperborean or Nordic supermen. An Aryan master race originating from a lost northern paradise, perhaps in the Atlantic, like Thule or Atlantis. This narrative fed directly into the toxic brew of German occultism and the political ideology of Aryan supremacy.
Wow, that's a dark turn for Plato's allegory.
A very dark turn. The occult history of Atlantis, though, perhaps culminates in the 20th century, at least in popular influence, with the American psychic Edgar Cayce, known as the Sleeping Prophet. His pronouncements on Atlantis remain absolutely central to New Age beliefs about it today.
Edgar Cayce. What did he add to the mix?
Cayce gave hundreds of life readings while in a trance state. He claimed he could access something called the Akashic Records.
Akashic Records? What's that?
It's a concept borrowed, again, partly from theosophy. Think of it as a kind of universal, ethereal library or database containing a record of every event, thought, word, and emotion that has ever occurred in the past, present, or future. Cayce claimed he could tap into this non-physical record during his trances and retrieve lost history directly.
So he could just download the history of Atlantis.
That was the claim, and he spoke extensively about Atlantis, dramatically embellishing Plato's original account. He added elements that had become staples of the modern mythos, things Plato never mentioned at all.
Like what? What did Cayce introduce?
He described Atlantis in vivid detail. He introduced concepts like highly advanced crystal-based energy systems, giant crystals used to power cities, vehicles, maybe even for healing or destruction. He talked about laser-like technology, flying ships or airships, and complex social structures.
Crystals and laser sounds very sci-fi.
Very much so. And most famously, perhaps, Cayce gave a date for its return. He predicted that parts of Atlantis would physically rise again from the ocean floor, becoming visible sometime in the late 1960s, specifically mentioning the Bimini area in the Bahamas.
Did that happen?
Well, no major landmass rose, obviously. But his prediction generated immense excitement and publicity during the counterculture era of the 60s, hugely boosting the myth's popularity. And he also asserted that a hidden hall of records, containing the complete history, wisdom, and technology of Atlantis, exists in a chamber somewhere beneath the paws of the Great Sphinx in Egypt.
The Sphinx. Still waiting to be found, I assume.
Still waiting. But that idea, the Hall of Records, remains a huge motivator for many alternative researchers exploring Giza even today. Case essentially modernized Atlantis, blending ancient myth with sci-fi tropes and spiritual seeking.
Okay, so given this absolute torrent of occult speculation, pseudoscientific theories, Casey's readings, the search for the physical location of Atlantis has become almost a separate field of inquiry in itself, hasn't it? It feels like it's completely divorced itself from Plato's original moral framework by this point.
Completely. The focus shifts almost entirely to geography and trying to make Plato's description fit somewhere on the modern map. But first, we really have to return just once more to that crucial ambiguity about the Pillars of Hercules.
Right, because where they were located changes everything.
Exactly. That potential shift in meaning from the Strait of Gibraltar out in the Atlantic to perhaps those mountains surrounding the Gulf of Laconia in Greece within the Mediterranean is key. If the pillars, in Solon's time or earlier, were understood to be in the Med, then the possibility of the story being based on a local, albeit massive, disaster becomes extremely compelling.
And if we accept that possibility, the Mediterranean inspiration, the strongest candidate remains Santorini, ancient Thera, and the Minoan eruption.
Right. It's widely considered the most plausible candidate for historical inspiration, yes. The eruption in the 17th or 16th century BC fits the profile. A powerful, sophisticated maritime culture, the Minoans on Crete, devastated suddenly by tsunamis and seismic activity linked to the volcanic collapse.
Have other Mediterranean places been suggested?
Oh, numerous others. People have tried to make cases for Sardinia, Sicily, Malta, Cyprus, even the city of Troy, or the semi-mythical Tartessos in southern Spain. These are mostly based on trying to force a match with some aspect of Plato's description, maybe concentric structures or known mining activity or proximity to ancient cultures mentioned. But their Minoan Crete remains the most academically discussed possibility for inspiration.
Okay. But the most popular interpretation, the one that fuels most of the modern myth and movies, definitely sticks with Plato's explicit location beyond the pillars, meaning out in the Atlantic Ocean.
Absolutely. That's where the cultural imagination usually goes. And that's where we find the most commonly cited candidates in popular culture. Islands like the Azores archipelago or the Canary Islands.
Why them specifically?
Well, they fit the general geographic setting. They are volcanic island groups located out in the Atlantic, west of Europe and Africa, sort of sitting on or near the mid-Atlantic ridge structure. They seem like plausible remnants of something larger that might have sunk.
Okay, seems logical on the surface. But here, we really have to calmly introduce the stark geological reality, don't we? Especially now we understand plate tectonics, which really became widely accepted in the 1960s. Why is the idea of a vast continent sinking rapidly in the Atlantic basically a geological impossibility?
Right. This is crucial. The sources, meaning modern geology, are very clear here. We need to understand just briefly that there are two fundamentally different types of Earth's crust. There's the thick, relatively light, buoyant continental crust that makes up the land masses.
Like Europe, America.
Exactly. And then there's the thinner, much denser oceanic crust that forms the ocean floors. Continents are essentially rafts of this lighter continental crust floating on the denser mantle beneath. They simply cannot rapidly sink or founder into the denser oceanic crust or mantle below. It's a matter of basic physics and density.
So a whole continent can't just plummet.
Not like that, no. Even in areas where crust does descend back into the mantle, like in subduction zones, where one tectonic plate slides beneath another, this is an incredibly slow geological process. It happens over millions and millions of years, not in a single day and night, as Plato's story describes, for a landmass supposedly larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined.
Yeah.
That kind of rapid subsidence for such a huge area fundamentally violates everything we know about geology and plate dynamics.
Okay. And what about the specific Atlantic islands, the Azores and Canaries? Have they been studied?
Extensively. Detailed bathymetric mapping the ocean floor, and geological studies show that these islands are volcanic hotspots. They are mountains built up from the ocean floor by volcanic activity. And crucially, geological evidence like raised beaches and submerged terraces indicates that these islands have actually been steadily uplifted over the last few million years, not sinking.
Uplifted. The opposite of sinking.
Exactly. The bedrock reality, the geological evidence, demonstrates the impossibility of a large-scale recent subsidence event in that part of the Atlantic. A small volcanic island can collapse in on itself, like Krakatoa or parts of Santorini did. But a continent-sized landmass cannot just vanish rapidly beneath the waves in geologically recent times.
That seems pretty definitive from a scientific perspective. Yet the search continues, doesn't it? People keep proposing other locations, often ignoring these physical constraints.
Oh, absolutely. The imagination runs wild. Hypotheses sometimes place the sunken island in northern Europe. For example, Doggerland, which was a real land bridge connecting Britain to mainland Europe in the North Sea.
That did exist, right?
It absolutely did. And it was flooded gradually by rising sea levels after the last ice age, and then perhaps catastrophically around 6100 BC by a mega tsunami generated by the Striga slide, a huge underwater landslide off Norway. So a sunken land, yes, but not really matching Plato's description or timeline.
Anywhere else? Ireland.
Ireland has been proposed too. A Swedish geographer named Ulf Erlingsson argued for a geographical match based on shape and size, but his claims were dismissed by archaeologists and historians as lacking any credible evidence.
And what about that controversial Spanish hypothesis you mentioned from 2011?
Yes. That involved a TV documentary claiming they'd found evidence of Atlantis buried in the marshlands of the Doñana National Park in southern Spain, which was an ancient lake or estuary called Lacus Ligustinus. They speculated it was destroyed by a massive tsunami radiating from the Atlantic.
Sounds dramatic. What was the evidence?
They pointed to some satellite imagery showing possible buried structures and some archaeological finds in the area. However, the sources make it crystal clear that this hypothesis was strongly publicly refuted by the academic community, including the collaborating Spanish archaeologists and researchers involved in the project itself. They accused the documentary makers of fanciful conclusions and sensationalizing ambiguous data for television.
So, not widely accepted then?
Not at all. The danger here, which you see repeatedly, is that selective interpretation of ambiguous geological features or unrelated historical finds, like finding Roman-era ruins near a marsh, is presented in the media as proof of an Atlantean cataclysm, ignoring context and chronology.
Okay. And then there are the really fringe locations.
Indeed. You get theories placing it near the Bahamas, focused on the famous Bimini Road or Bimini Wall. This is an underwater formation of large rectangular limestone blocks. Believers claim it's an ancient Atlantean road, harbor wall, or building foundation.
But what do geologists say it is?
Geologists overwhelmingly identify it as a natural formation of beach rock, where beach sediments cement together underwater in parallel lines, which then fracture over time into block-like shapes. It's a known natural process.
So natural rocks, not man-made walls.
That's the scientific consensus. And finally, you even get theories placing the lost continent beneath the ice sheets of Antarctica. These often reference the disputed interpretation of the Peary Race map, a 16th century map that some claim accurately shows the Antarctic coastline without its ice cover, implying ancient source maps from a time before glaciation, possibly Atlantean.
That seems a stretch.
It requires many layers of speculation and misinterpretation of the map itself. But what really stands out when you look at all these proposed locations across the globe is that the complete lack of any concrete, unambiguous supporting evidence allows the imagination to roam universally. Atlantis can be placed almost anywhere the theorist desires.
Right. We've journeyed from Plato's original, quite specific philosophical warning through centuries of interpretation, occult embellishment, and now these widespread, often geologically implausible location hunts. We really need to anchor ourselves back now as we conclude to the foundational academic verdict and maybe try to understand why this idea refuses to fade away.
Okay. The consensus among professional philologists, classicists, and ancient historians remains virtually unanimous and hasn't really changed since Aristotle. Atlantis, as described by Plato, is a fictional device. It was created by him to serve as a negative example in a philosophical and political discussion.
A teaching tool.
Teaching tool, exactly. His purpose was to use this grand story to examine ideas about ideal governance, the corrupting influence of power and wealth, the dangers of imperialism, contrasting his idealized vision of ancient Athens with this fallen, decadent, materialistic naval empire.
There's a quote from the Plato scholar Julia Ennis that seems to capture the academic frustration with the endless search for physical evidence, isn't there?
Yes, it's very pointed. She stated quite clearly. The continuing industry of discovering Atlantis illustrates the dangers of reading Plato, for he is clearly using what has become a standard device of fiction. The dialogues are not history and should not be read as such. We have missed the point if instead of thinking about these philosophical issues, we go off exploring the seabed.
We have missed the point. That says it all, really.
It perfectly captures the core scholarly position. The obsessive focus on geology, on finding ruins, completely ignores the moral and political lesson Plato intended to impart to his fellow Athenians, and perhaps to posterity. The story was very likely a warning reflecting contemporary Athenian concerns, maybe about their own naval expansion or the disastrous Sicilian expedition they undertook.
Which raises the critical question then, for you listening. If the academic consensus is so strong, and the geological evidence against a literal, recently sunken Atlantic continent is so overwhelming, why does the belief that conspiracy endure so powerfully right into the 21st century? What's the appeal?
Well, it seems to appeal very deeply to certain aspects of the psychology of belief.
Ugh.
Firstly, there's clearly a powerful, almost universal human fascination with the concept of lost knowledge.
Lost golden ages, ancient wisdom.
Exactly. That romantic idea that profound mysteries or perhaps a superior ancient wisdom exists, hidden from us, maybe deliberately suppressed by mainstream science or academia. This often appeals to a deep-seated dissatisfaction with the perceived flaws, complexities, or spiritual emptiness of modern society. Finding Atlantis would prove we weren't always like this.
And crucially, this is often bolstered by a strong anti-establishment sentiment, isn't it?
Very much so. These alternative theories often thrive among individuals or groups who harbor a profound distrust of mainstream historians, archaeologists, and scientists. There's often a belief that these authorities are actively suppressing evidence that would overturn established timelines, challenge evolutionary theory, or disrupt accepted historical or religious paradigms.
The cover-up narrative.
The classic cover-up narrative. And this distrust is then fed directly by confirmation bias. Believers will selectively interpret ambiguous evidence like those natural rock formations at Bimini, or maybe a blurry sonar image or an ancient text taken out of context to support their existing, often emotionally satisfying conviction that a profound mystery remains hidden, just out of reach. They find what they're looking for.
But beyond the realm of pure conspiracies or pseudoscience, Atlantis has also enjoyed this remarkable literary and artistic afterlife, hasn't it? It continues to inspire powerful narratives purely as a metaphor for something lost, unattainable, or maybe spiritually significant.
Yes, its cultural persistence as a symbol is perhaps even more interesting than the pseudo-history. We see its application evolve constantly. After those Renaissance utopian works used it as a blueprint for ideal societies.
Yeah.
The myth became more internalized in later literature. The sheer power of the image, a magnificent civilization sinking beneath the waves, resonated strongly with poets. W.H. Auden, for example, wrote a famous poem called Atlantis.
What was his take?
For Auden, the journey to Atlantis wasn't really a geographical search anymore. It became a metaphor for an inward spiritual quest, a search for meaning or perfection within oneself. He focused on the search itself being the point.
How so?
He wrote that the true seekers, after a long and perhaps futile journey towards the idea of Atlantis, eventually realized that the way has all the time led inward. The impossibility of finding the physical place becomes a metaphor for the impossibility of finding perfect external fulfillment, forcing the seeker to look within for meaning.
That's profound.
It is. And the Irish poet Evan Boland also used the image very powerfully, focusing on the finality and the irretrievable nature of loss. She defined the idea perfectly when she spoke of the ancient writers, saying they searched hard for a word to convey that what is gone forever. Atlantis embodies that absolute finality, that devastating sense of complete loss.
Gone forever. And visually, the myth has really been cemented in the public consciousness by some powerful artistic renderings over the centuries, right?
Absolutely. Paintings like François de Nomé's dramatic The Fall of Atlantis, or Leon Bach's even more striking symbolist painting Ancient Terror, Terra Antiquus, from the early 20th century.
What does the Bach's want to show?
It depicts this giant goddess figure looming over a coastal city being violently breached by a green apocalyptic sea under a dramatic lightning strike. It perfectly captures that sense of cosmic judgment, overwhelming catastrophe, and the fragility of civilization against the forces of nature or fate. It's pure symbolic power.
And even contemporary art still uses the imagery.
It does, often as commentary. The Croatian sculptor Ivan Mitrović created a haunting walking female figure he entitled Atlantis back in 1946, perhaps reflecting unjustified suffering after the war. More recently, artists like the Belgian sculptor Luc van Zoom have used the image of a sinking city, sometimes explicitly Atlantis, to comment on very current problems like the threat of global warming and rising sea levels. The myth adapts again, becoming a warning for our own time.
So we have completed our slow, hopefully contemplative reflection. We've observed Atlantis evolve from what was likely a very precise Greek philosophical thought experiment into this global cultural symbol. And yes, the bedrock for countless modern theories, both insightful and outlandish. Ultimately, the story seems less about finding a physical location on a map and far more about charting the enduring landscape of human desire, human fear, and human imagination.
I think that's right. The true power of Atlantis, as the sources really reveal when you look at its long journey, lies in its remarkable adaptability, its sheer flexibility as an idea.
Yeah.
Whether you choose to view it through Plato's original lens, a moral critique of imperial overreach and hubris,
Right.
or through the lens of modern esoteric claims about crystal power and lost races, or even as just a symbol of any great loss, the core narrative of a magnificent, complex civilization, ultimately destroyed, perhaps by its own success, its own technological pride, its own moral failings. That story resonates across all ages and cultures.
So what does this all mean for us, for you listening? If Atlantis truly was intended by Plato at its root as a kind of moral warning, a fable about the dangers of rapid naval expansion, technological arrogance, unchecked decadent power, well, we're left with this final, quiet, contemplative question to ponder. What contemporary human pursuit, despite all its technological grandeur, its massive ambition, its perceived invincibility, what aspect of our own civilization do you think could be our own metaphoric Atlantis? Perhaps destined, if we're not careful, to sink beneath the waves of history.